Good evening and welcome to our Wednesday night study. Before we start, I'd like to give you just a couple of announcements. Don't usually do it, but we need to do this. There will be no Bible study next Wednesday, that is the 22nd. We'll be back the week after, which is the 29th. And then some good news. The following week, Wednesday of August 5th, we'll do their Wednesday night study right here, and it'll be Isaiah exclusively every Wednesday. And then Thursday, we're going to have in-person study at the Healing Place, studying strictly Psalms. So, as you note those things, please be aware of it. Let me give you a little bit of in the news today, what's going on. So as we start the New World Order, you know our classifications that are there. These two women are the Germans are coming under the title. Ursula von der Leyen is the current EU Commissioner President. And on July 1st, Angela Merkel took over the 6-month rotating presidency of the European Council. Both women are German, and they will occupy Europe's two most powerful posts. In the words of Spiegel International magazine, the European Union is set to be run by two German women with a long history. The continent might never be the same, they said on June 7th, as these two experienced and extensively driven individuals hold Europe's highest positions for the next 6 months. What lasting effects on the EU and in the world we see? Now remember, our study in Revelation, the EU, European Union, is really the predecessor to the 10-nation confederacy, even though it's not there yet. This is the beast of Revelation. So it goes on to say, strong German leadership is now being called for. It says the German language is becoming increasingly popular throughout the continent. That's from Politico on June 26th. Bible prophecy is clear about the fact that Germany will play a powerful role in Europe and the world at the end of the age. The next 6 months could have a major impact on the future of Europe and Germany's coming leadership. So why does that article say that? Well, let me give you a prophecy of Antichrist and the three nations he will overrun in the coming European 10-nation confederacy. It comes from Daniel. And it says, and after this I saw in the night visions, and behold, a fourth beast, dreadful and terrible, and strong exceedingly, and it had great iron teeth. It devoured and brake in pieces, and stamped the residue at the feet of it, and it was diverse from all the other beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns. That's where you get your 10-nation confederacy. I considered the horns, and behold, there came up among them another little horn, that is the Antichrist himself, before whom there were 3 of the first horns plucked up by the roots. Now, those 3 horns are 3 nations. Those horns represent nations. So what would be the 3 nations? Well, the 3 most powerful nations right now in the EU are not in reverse order. I'll give it to you. The 3 most influential, according to a recent poll, are in reverse order: France, Italy, which is pretty interesting because we know that Antichrist will be fueled, will be the revived Roman Empire, and Antichrist will be fueled by the false prophet, who is obviously a pope from Italy. And then, yes, Germany. Germany is #1 influential nation. So Germany is in Bible prophecy. It may be one of the 3 that brings him to power that he actually turns against. So we're watching some really prophetic things going on in European nation right now. Let me give you a little bit more as we go. On Black Lives Matter, we've been talking about this all the time, versus BLM movement doctrine. There is a difference. So we should urge Christian conservatives and other people of conscience to distinguish between the important affirmation that Black lives do matter and the BLM movement. Now, as for the BLM movement, it should be exposed for what it is. And let me just tell you, we're hearing more and more on the dangers of this BLM movement. God himself affirms that Black lives matter. We know that. And the BLM organization is dangerous. It's anti-Christian, and it should by all means be avoided. And I want to continue to underscore that and tell you why. Here's what we know about the BLM movement, especially when we dig a little deeper into their what we believe statement that they have on the internet. When you start to connect the dots, you'll understand why. BLM as dangerous, and it is anti-Christian. BLM was founded by 3 black women, Patrice Cullors, Alicia Garza, and Opal Tometi. The first to identify as queer, and the third is a transnational feminist. Speaking of Cullors, a website celebrating lesbians who tech states, quote, when Patrice was 16 years old, she came out as queer and moved out of her home in the valley. The official BLM site describes Garza as a queer black woman who states that we must view this epidemic through the lens of race, gender, sexual orientation, and gender identity. The official BLM site describes Garza as a queer black woman, obviously. That's why in June 21st, 2020 article on ABC News declared, from the start, the founders of Black Lives Matter have always put LGBTQ voices at the center of the conversation. On a certain level, reading through the official BLM statement, being queer is as much an issue for the movement as being black. The statement reads, quote, we foster a queer affirming network. When we gather, we do so with the intention of freeing ourselves from the tight grip of heteronormative thinking, or rather the belief that all in the world are heterosexual. Thus, the only references to heterosexuality are negative, and meaning the assumption that heterosexuality is the norm, and they don't want it that way. So BLM is not just fighting against white privilege, but also against heterosexual privilege. Make no mistake about it. But there's more, and this has often been missed in the commentary about BLM beliefs. While there are references to mothers and parents in their statements, there is not one single reference to fathers, not one. As for mention of men or the idea of a male household, these are only found in total negative contexts. We build a space, they say, that affirms black women and is free from sexism, misogyny, and the environments in which men are centered. And this, we make our spaces family friendly and enable parents to fully participate with their children. We dismantle the patriarchal practice that requires mothers to work double shifts so they can mother in private, even as they participate in public justice work. Yes, that oppressive husband-wife, male-female union, that outdated, outmoded, patriarchal dinosaur, they say it must be dismantled. A truly fair relationship would have the husband home with the kids while the wife is out doing public justice work. This is the language of radical feminism in its unabashed, undistinguished form. This too is part of the queer, trans-affirming spirit. As for the third founder, Opal Tometi, she is also described as a student of liberation theology. And there is now the widely circulated quote from her that she and Garza are trained Marxists. As for the connection between liberation theology and Marxism, especially in this context, Professor Anthony Bradley, himself black, has pointed out that BLM liberation is a Marxist liberation. So without question, the official BLM movement is Marxist-based, queer-affirming, trans activism, traditional marriage degrading, radical feminist promoting, and more. In a sense, it is fatherless as well. The BLM organization is dangerous, anti-Christian, and should be avoided. So we all really need to be aware of what's going on before someone dons a shirt. Let me give you a little bit more. This one's under embracing celebrities too quickly usually results in disappointment. Kanye West. So I've always been skeptical, this article writer says, of the pro-life celebrity. Not because I don't think that celebrities who sincerely oppose abortion don't exist, but because I believe celebrities are both unreliable and often undesirable advocates. An artist or actor may oppose abortion while creating sexually charged entertainment that contributes to the denigration of our culture. For example, in the case of pop stars like Selena Gomez, who swapped her purity ring for an abortion bling, they discard their previous views due to industry pressures and peers. Pro-life celebrities generally fall into two categories. First, there are those who oppose abortion for profoundly personal reasons. Jack Nicklaus, for example, discovered later in life that his mother was actually his grandmother, and that the woman he thought was his sister was his mother, who had been pressured to abort him. As a result, he noted in one interview when asked about abortion, quote, "I'm positively against it. I don't have the right to any other view." Similarly, singer Celine Dion was her mother's 14th child and initially considered an abortion before being talked out of it. Justin Bieber's mother was also pressured to abort him, and he has stated that he thinks abortion is like killing a baby. Martin Sheen's wife was conceived through rape, a fact that he has referenced with regard to his anti-abortion views. Despite this, Sheen is a dedicated Democrat, and it's important to him that many pro-life celebrities still vocally support pro-abortion politics. There's also those who are pro-life as part of a larger worldview. Patricia Heaton, who often shares pro-life content on social media, is a Catholic. So is Mel Gibson, who has shaped his pro-life views in interviews and has contributed financially to the pro-life work in the past. Hollywood's handful of conservatives are generally pro-life as well, including Jon Voight, Tom Selleck, and Chuck Norris. Conservatives, of course, are becoming even rarer in Hollywood in the wake of the Great Awakening, or should I say the Great Awokening, which is accompanied by purges of those with even liberal sentiments. And then there is Kanye West, a man who defies all categories. On Independence Day, he announced that he is off the Trump train and running for president of the United States, although thus far, no campaign has materialized. He says he will be running for the birthday party because when we win, it's everybody's birthday, he says. Back in 2011, West tweeted that an abortion can cost blanking blank up to 50 G's, maybe 100. Gold digging blanks be getting pregnant on purpose. And then, in an interview for his latest album, he criticized the Democrats for making us abort our children. Last week, he expanded on those views, telling Forbes that Planned Parenthood has been placed inside cities by white supremacists to do the devil's work, a reference to the racist and eugenicist history of American abortion giant. I am pro-life, because I am following the word of the Bible, he says. Cain recently tweeted and then deleted a screenshot of a Google search for what does a 6-month fetus look like? Along with the now deleted image, he wrote, "These souls deserve to live." It is unquestionably good for the pro-life cause that a man with such an enormous platform is using it to call out the American abortion industry. As West reaches an audience that pro-lifers have often had difficulty reaching. With that said, pro-lifers would do well to be cautious. West is notoriously erratic, and a lot of his ramblings can end up being pretty weird. In a culture obsessed with celebrity, there's a huge temptation to immediately promote and embrace any famous person saying some of the right things. While encouraging and affirming those things is essential, we shouldn't give these folks the status of moral leadership overnight. Man, that needs to be underscored and then dotted. We see a celebrity, they come out maybe for God, and that's wonderful, but they are not our moral compass. They are still baby Christians. They're still learning, so we got to be very careful. West in particular has gone on a roller coaster with regard to many of his different views, and his reliability, despite hopeful indicators, remains to be seen. We should not make celebrities, even those going after the abortion industry, into our heroes, and that's the truth. Let me give you a little bit more as we talk about America and the sad state it's in right now. This article is Dismantling America: Progressives and Conservatives Battle for the Nation's Future. Democratic Congresswoman Ilhan Omar of Minnesota is courting controversy again, stating at an event earlier this week that America must move far beyond simply addressing racism in policing. It is time, Omar asserted, to begin dismantling the American economy itself. I'm stating what she said, as long as our economy and political systems prioritize profit without considering who is profiting, who is being shut out, we will perpetrate this inequality, Omar stated. We cannot stop at the criminal justice system. We must begin the work of dismantling the whole system of oppression wherever we find it. Predictably, conservatives have been condemning Omar's calls to dismantle the economy. And Omar has responded by claiming that her comments have been taken out of context. They really are straightforward. Omar is a paradoxical politician. She identifies as a Muslim, but also as an intersectional feminist, a supporter of the entire LGBT agenda, and an advocate of legal abortion. The tenets of her alleged religious faith, Islam, do not seem to be as important to her as the intersectional credibility it lends to her public persona. She is also a member of what is colloquially known as the Squad, a group of hyper-progressive young politicians seeking to pull the Democratic Party sharply to the left. Early this week, to cite just one example, she condemned the Supreme Court's decision to allow an order of nuns, the Little Sisters of the Poor, to opt out of providing birth control and abortifacient drugs. Noting Planned Parenthood's endorsement of her, she tweeted, "Today's disastrous SCOTUS decision means that your employer or university can deny you birth control based on religious or moral objectives." I would hope they could. Grateful to have the Planned Parenthood support as we fight back for reproductive justice. We will not relent. So even though she says she's Islamic, she's going totally against the Islamic faith by saying things like that. Many suspect that Omar and her fellow Squad members prefer the French Revolution in order to dismantle America. So it's ironic that both progressives and social conservatives are now often united, listen to this, in the belief that American experiment is on the brink of collapse. For progressives like Omar, it's because America is a hotbed of racial hatred, homophobia, and injustice that must be raised and rebuilt. For social conservatives, it's the fact that the American Revolution has been poisoned by the sexual revolution, with 65 million abortions and counting, religious liberty under fire, and a pornified, sexually dysfunctional culture. Omar and her ilk believe that more of all that will make America a better place. Social conservatives believe that without a course correction, America will die. In some ways, both progressives and social conservatives believe that there is much that needs to be dismantled. But for progressives, it's any trace of American founding. For social conservatives, it's the industries killing America's future. Planned Parenthood, Pornhub, and progressive academia, to name a few. Only one side can win. And make no mistake, winner will take all in this war. Let me give you a little bit more as the hot issues, I call them the hot potatoes, the things that not many churches will talk about. This is weaponizing words. White supremacy is the new homophobia, and we really need to be alerted to what's going on in our culture. The term homophobia can be traced back to George Weinberg, a psychotherapist who in the mid-1960s observed the discomfort that some of his colleagues exhibited around gay men and women and invented a word to describe it, homophobia. As Dr. Weinberg explained, I coined the word homophobia to mean it was a phobia about homosexuals. It was a fear of homosexuals, which seemed to be associated with a fear of contagion, a fear of reducing the things that they fought for, home and family. It was a religious fear, and it had led to a great brutality, as fear always does. But in the years following, the term homophobia and homophobe became weaponized, used as an offensive weapon in the culture wars. And that's what we're seeing right now. We're seeing words becoming weaponized. If you oppose same-sex marriage, for example, you were a homophobe. If you believe the child deserved a mother and a father, you're a homophobe. If you affirm the teaching of the Bible, you're a homophobe. Nothing of this is the definition of homophobe. And if you were a homophobe, you were also a bigot, hater, a bad person, even a Nazi. What fair-minded, decent person would want to be described like that? And who wants to have a phobia? It's the same today with the term white supremacy and white supremacist. Initially, they were used to describe people who openly believed in the supremacy of the white race over all other races. In American history, they were slave traders and segregationists. They were the KKK of the past and the alternate right of today. White supremacists have also been anti-Semites, Holocaust deniers, neo-Nazis, and members of the skinhead culture. White supremacy is ugly, it's bad, and no decent, fair-minded person would want to be called a white supremacist. That's why these terms, just like homophobia and homophobe, have been weaponized today. If you're a Trump supporter, you're a white supremacist. If you differ with any part of the BLM movement, you're a white supremacist. If you resist the mob, you're a white supremacist. If you don't believe in reparations, you're a white supremacist. After all, if you were not a white supremacist, why would you resist reparations? If you don't agree with tearing down statues of Washington and Jefferson, you're a white supremacist. After all, they owned slaves, so if you want to honor their legacy, you must be a white supremacist. The logic is irresistible. If you simply do not believe that America today is, by and large, a white supremacist nation, then you're a white supremacist. Your very denial of white supremacy is proof that you're a white supremacist. And if you're a white Christian conservative, by default, you are a white supremacist. Dr. Michael Ashton wrote, "This political right-wing Christianity isn't Christianity, it's white cultural supremacy, shamefully using Jesus as a shield." Think about that. So they're bending everybody into white supremacy if you have any other opinion. There you have it. If you're a Christian-based social conservative, you are part of the political right wing. And if you are part of the political right wing, you're a white supremacist. And since you claim to be a Christian, you're using Jesus as a shield, they say. It follows the standard strategy to try to shame one's opponents into silence. And that's what's happening today. They're trying to shame people into silence. In the recent past, and until today, the tactic was to brand everyone who opposed any facet of LGBTQ activism a homophobe. Do you have a problem with drag queens reading to toddlers? I do. They'll say, I'm a homophobe. You don't want first graders learning the definition of genderqueer? I don't. Well, you're a hater and a bigot. You're a homophobe. Now, if you like President Trump's Mount Rushmore speech, it's because you're a white supremacist. Forget the fact that he said, we believe in equal opportunity, equal justice, equal treatment for citizens of every race, background, religion, and creed. Every child of every color, born and unborn, is made in the holy image of God, end of quote. Or that he said this, our opponents would tear apart the very documents that Martin Luther King used to express his dreams and the ideas that were the foundation of the righteous movement for the civil rights. Or that he said this, we must demand that our children are taught once again to see America as did Reverend Martin Luther King, when he said that the founders had signed a promissory note to every future generation. Dr. King saw that the mission of justice required us to fully embrace our founding ideals. Those ideals are so important to us, the founding ideals, King said. He called on his fellow citizens, listen to this, he called on his fellow citizens not to rip down their heritage, but to live up to their heritage. So we're watching something really happen, words becoming weaponized and grouping people into masses with one word. Let me give you a little bit more as we talk about culture. 5 ways to conquer the cancel culture. So what can you do? What can you and I do with this cancel culture that's coming out? Well, as expected, the cancel culture is already out of control, and now it's devouring itself. One day it's the statue of Teddy Roosevelt. The next day it's the smash musical Hamilton. One day it's J.K. Rowling. The next, it's a Vox editor who's still with Rowling. How do we overcome this dangerous and self-destructive culture? Well, here's 5 simple steps. Number 1, speak louder. The concept is simple. The more people try to silence you, the louder you need to speak. The more they try to shut you up, the louder you need to shout. The more doors they shut in your face, the more you need to open. You use the attempts to silence you as a platform on which you stand. Number 2, learn the principle of losing your life to save it. This is powerful. This is something that Jesus spoke of frequently. He said, For whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoso loses his life for my sake will find it. It's Matthew 16:25. So what exactly did he mean? Well, a famous sermon by Dr. Martin Luther King explains the essence of what the Lord was saying, and he really hits the nail on the head. Speaking at a church that was gathered in Selma, Alabama, on March 8, 1965, King said, quote, "If a man happens to be 36 years old, as I happen to be, and some great truth stands before the door of his life, some great opportunity to stand up for that which is right, he's afraid of his home will get bombed, or if he's afraid he will lose his job, or if he's afraid that he will get shot or beaten down by state troopers, he may go on and live until he's 80, but he's just as dead at 36 as he would be at 80. And the cessation of breathing in his life is merely the belated announcement of an earlier death of the spirit." Listen to what he's saying. We save our lives by losing them, meaning by standing for what is right, no matter what the cost or what the consequence. Yes, he continued, a man dies when he refuses to stand up for that which is right. A man dies when he refuses to stand up for justice. A man dies when he refuses to take a stand for that which is true. So we lose our lives trying to save them. Conversely, we save our lives by losing them, meaning by standing for what is right, no matter the cost or no matter the consequences. The cancel culture can take nothing from us because we have surrendered our lives to God and his purposes. In doing so, we die to human threats. They can no longer hurt us. Number 3, expose the folly of the cancel culture. Winston Churchill once said this, "Each one hopes that if he feeds the crocodile enough, the crocodile will eat him last. All of them hope that the storm will pass before their turn comes to be devoured." An appeaser, he's saying, is one who feeds a crocodile, hoping it'll eat him last. We need to expose this reality, demonstrating how the cancel culture will ultimately cancel itself out, and it will, by the way. It must, since it will never be sufficiently woke. Let me illustrate it. In the spirit of pulling down historic statues and removing racist brand names, should there be a move to cancel the Democratic Party? Since it was the Democrats were the party of slavery, they were the party of segregation, and they were a party of Jim Crow. So should we not tear down the Democrats? Where does it end? Who will be left standing? There is now a movement within Planned Parenthood to renounce its white supremacy, which is soon lead right back to its founder, Margaret Sanger. So, when the cancelers realize they might be next on the list, they might just think twice. Better still, they will recognize the folly of the cancel culture. Number 4, learn to forgive from the heart. Powerful. The NFL's Deason Jackson recently made a horrible mistake, posting the alleged words of Hitler in a plainly anti-Semitic comment. This is inexcusable under any circumstance. Since then, Jackson has offered multiple apologies and has pledged to meet with a local rabbi to learn and understand. He should be forgiven, not canceled. He should be educated, not eradicated. I mean from the NFL. All of us are the recipients of divine mercy. Otherwise, we would be dead. And I would dare say that all of us have also received human mercy at some point in our lives. We should also show mercy to others. Number 5, make room for differing opinions. And this is really something that needs to be underscored. Another Paulinian principle is this: do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. Romans 12:21. We cannot defeat the cancel culture by becoming like it. We must become the opposite of it. We must be so secure in our views that we welcome dissenting opinions, that we do not marginalize those who differ with us. We can speak our minds clearly and forcibly. We can vote for policies we believe are the best in the best interest for our country. We can be dogmatic in our convictions and our values, and we need to be. But we cannot silence or cancel out those who differ with us. They're going to differ. I wholly disapprove of what you say, but I will defend the death your right to say it. That's what the cancel culture is not doing it. They have a right to say anything they want, but so do you. So we're not talking about someone's right to break the law with his or her speech or actions, since not everything is protected by the First Amendment. And you have every right to forbid certain speech or opinions from your own platform. For example, if you run a vegan recipe website, you have the right to remove comments that offer beef recipes or that mock vegans. But when it comes to the public square, be it the university classroom, the workplace of Facebook, if the law is not being broken, let freedom reign. If somebody has a say, let them say it. Don't stop squashing and squelching conservative voices. This is how we overcome the cancel culture, by gaining strength from it, by becoming oblivious to it, by exposing it, by being merciful, and by being better at it than them. Let me give you a little bit for Israel, how we're going there. We know that Israel's right on the peak of prophecy. And let me tell you something, things are starting to come to a boiling point in Israel. This says war drums, Iran and Israel on the brink of conflict, and they are. Over the past several weeks, a series of mysterious explosions has happened at very strategic, sensitive locations inside Iran. And it has also become obvious that what we are witnessing is not just a bunch of random accidents. For years, the Israeli government has pledged that the Iranians will never be allowed to develop nuclear weapons. And several of the sites where the mystery explosions have taken place have direct connections to Iran's nuclear program. Israel is behind the explosion and fire at Iran's Natanz nuclear complex caused by a powerful bomb, a Middle Eastern intelligence official with knowledge of the incident told the New York Times on Monday. A member of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps confirmed to the Times that an explosive was used in the incident as well. Of course, there have been several other mysterious explosions. Computer viruses similar to Stuxnet's virus may have been involved in at least some of the blasts. For 5 recent explosions in Iran may have been caused by computer viruses similar to the Stuxnet virus that has disabled Iranian centrifuges in 2010. 2 of the blasts took place at power plants, one at a missile research, development, and production site, one at a new uranium enrichment centrifuge center, and the last in downtown Tehran at a medical facility that could have been a cover for nuclear operations such as a hidden command center. So the Israeli government has been forced into a position where it must take a very tough choice. Either Israel must be willing to accept Iran as a nuclear power, or Israel must do something to stop it from happening. At this point, it's been confirmed that the industrial shed that was destroyed during the explosion at the Natanz uranium enrichment facility was in fact a new site for assembling centrifuges, and that would definitely be a logical target for the Israelis to hit. When Israeli Defense Minister Benny Gantz was asked if Israel had anything to do with the mysterious explosions, he reportedly told the Israeli radio, "Not every incident that transpires in Iran necessarily has something to do with us. All those systems are complex. They have very high safety constraints, and I'm not sure they always know how to maintain them," he said, according to Reuters. Obviously, that's not a denial. And let me tell you something, Israel will do everything in its power to stop Iran from getting a nuclear weapon, because Iran is a rogue nation, and they know what they're going to do as soon as they get it. They're going to nuke Israel, so they will definitely stop it any way they can. Meanwhile, it is also being reported that the Mossad has thwarted a series of planned Iranian attacks on Israeli embassies around the world. Israeli spy agency Mossad claims it has recently thwarted a series of planned Iranian attacks on Israeli embassies around the world. The Iranians are becoming increasingly frustrated by the success of Israeli covert operations, and they want to find ways to strike back. Embassies are typically easy targets, soft targets. But thankfully, the Mossad has apparently been one step ahead of all Iranian efforts to target embassies so far. Needless to say, all of this is happening at a time when tensions in the region are rapidly coming to a boil. An advisor to Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas warned Saturday that there was a possibility of a third intifada if the Israeli government goes ahead with its plan to annex parts of the West Bank. And the truth is that rocket fire has already started. On Sunday, this past Sunday, Israeli planes hit targets in the Gaza Strip after a barrage of rocket fire into southern Israel. In a statement, the Israeli military said attack helicopters and fighter jets struck underground infrastructure belonging to Gaza's ruling Hamas terrorist group. The bottom line is that the Middle East has been on the precipice of a major war for years, and it certainly isn't going to take much to push things over the edge. If the Iranians do not stop their nuclear program, the Israelis are going to continue to hit them, and that will eventually spark a war. And if Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu goes ahead with his plan to annex portions of Judea and Samaria, that is almost certain to spark a war too. We have reached a critical moment in Israel, and it appears to be just a matter of time before a great conflict erupts. This could be the beginning of Psalm 83 war. I suggest you read that, Psalm 83, about the coalition of nations that go against Israel. And this one's kind of an interesting one. This is something that's pretty positive. This is the Jezreel Valley in Israel in the early 1900s, a barren wasteland. This article says this: how Israel rescued the Promised Land from devastation and neglect. From the Jezreel Valley in the lower upper Galilee regions to the Golan Heights, the natural beauty of the part of Israel, as well as the explosive proliferation of agriculture, is striking and it's inspiring. The abundance of flora in Israel today makes it easy to forget that this land at the turn of the 20th century, the picture you're looking at, was a parched wasteland. It also raised the question, how did this miraculous transformation take place and who is responsible? On his visit to Palestine in 1867, Samuel Clemens, you'll know him as Mark Twain, called the Sea of Galilee, quote, a solemn, sailless, tintless lake, as unpoetical as any bathtub on earth. He said, I found the Kinneret, which is the Hebrew name for the Sea of Galilee, a sparkling blue jewel surrounded on its north, south, and west by vegetable fields, orchards, and forests. He didn't say that. That's a recent traveler said that. Total opposite. Here is the Jezreel Valley again from the turn of the century. Parched, growing nothing. There it is again, desert. Traveling by horseback through the Jezreel Valley, Clements noted, there is not a solitary village throughout its whole extent, not for 30 miles in either direction. There are 2 or 3 small clusters of Bedouin tents, they're wandering shepherds, but not a single permanent habitation. One may ride 10 miles and not see human beings. Clements continues, of all the lands there are for dismal scenery, I think Palestine must be the prime. Palestine sits in sackcloth and ashes. Over it broods the spell of a curse that has withered its fields and fettered its energies. The Jezreel Valley around 1900, picture you're seeing, remained an undeveloped swamp, described as barren and boring, a miserable plain without a tree or a river, all in ruins. One traveler in 1905 described mud so deep that the mules fell and the donkeys almost vanished in it. It wasn't until 1924 that the Zionist settlers finished the Herculean two-year task of converting these marshes into the rich, fertile farmland that I talked about just a moment ago. Palestine's devastation can be attributed to many factors, mostly centered on poverty. At the turn of the century, an estimated 70% of the area's Arab inhabitants were subsistence farmers. They took what they needed from the land, including unreplenished wood for fire, and allowed unrestrained sheep and goat grazing, as well as the hunting of native species like the Syrian bear and the small deer, which they made promptly extinct. However, Jewish immigration, bearing great intention and aspirations, had begun. Within a few generations, it would transform this neglected, relatively barren territory into a lush cornucopia of food and forests with a majority Jewish population. What happened in the 100 years between 1920 and 2020? Well, Zionists focused on agriculture to support Israel's growing population of both Jews and Arabs. The new immigrants purchased land that was largely semi-arid, much of which had become untillable due to deforestation, soil erosion, and neglect. These pioneers cleared the rocky fields, built terraces, drained swamps, planted trees, fought soil erosion, and desalinated salty land. Today, Israel is a major exporter of fresh produce and a world leader in agricultural technologies, notwithstanding the reality that Israel's geography is not naturally hospitable to agriculture. More than half of Israel's land area is desert, and its climate and dearth of water resources discourage farming. Imagine only 20% of Israel's land area is naturally arable, yet Israel now produces some 95% of its own food requirements. Much of the success, of course, is owed to Israel's phenomenal, groundbreaking inventions in agriculture and food technology, starting with drip irrigation and water desalination. Israeli dairy cows are the most productive cows on the planet. Even more astounding, since Israel attained independence in 1948, the total area of under cultivation has skyrocketed to approximately 1.1 million acres. In just the past 50 years, agricultural settlements have grown from 400 to 850. Agricultural production has expanded by a factor of 30% greater than Israel's population growth. Wine also represents a thriving, expanding agricultural enterprise in Israel. Today, in their territory only the size of New Jersey, Israel supports some 320 wineries. As for Israel's abundant forests, we can thank millions of North American and Israeli donors to the Jewish National Fund and its parent, Keren Kayemet LeIsrael, which have planted more than 240 million trees in Israel. This effort alone has transformed the land of Israel, provided groves, woods, and forests of conifer, deciduous, and fruit trees all over the country. In short, the Israeli miracle is far greater than the unsurpassed achievement of creating one of the world's most successful and powerful nations, made of millions of Jewish refugees from all over the globe, most returning to their homeland in just 150 years. It's more, too, than reviving and reinventing the Hebrew language, which was dead for 3,000 years. Israel is also a miracle of restoring a depleted, deteriorating land through determination, ingenuity, and back-breaking work. That's the picture you see of the Jezreel Valley in the 1900s. Here it is today. It is unbelievable. Israel has, in effect, rescued the land of Palestine. Beautiful, thriving Israel supports some 9 million Arabs and Jews, almost 13 times more people than in 1900, all enjoying one of the world's highest standards of living and the best food in the Middle East. Now, why did I show you all that? Why did I read it? Well, because it's prophetic. It wasn't just a coincidence that happened. Yes, it was hard work, but listen to Nehemiah and the prophecy. Restore, I pray you, to them, even this day, their lands, their vineyards. Remember, I just told you about it. Their olive yards, their houses, also the 100th part of the money, that's their economy, and of the corn, the wine, and the oil. So it is definitely something that was prophesied way back in Nehemiah's time. Let's go a little bit to the economy. And this one should shock you a little bit. Well, actually, before we go to the economy, let me give you one last one from Israel, if I can do that. Annexation will probably go smoothly. The problems will come later. An article comes out today. The timing and scope of the plan is still uncertain. But when Israel announces its expected decision to annex parts of the occupied West Bank, the world's attention will turn to the immediate impact. People who care about the region will be watching closely to see if the Palestinians rise up in protest, as they said they would. If the Palestinian Authority will collapse, however, or be disbanded. If Arab countries cut off budding ties with Israel, like Jordan. Or if the European countries impose sanctions on Israel or recognize a Palestinian state. After all, the warnings that annexation will trigger disaster, all eyes will be on how the various parties respond. You know, it's interesting to me that Israel, this small, tiny nation, size of Vermont, is in the news so much, and how the world is vying for all kinds of opinions about it. If you look at Revelation, and if you look at the 7-year tribulation, you'll know that Israel is the focal point of Antichrist. It's amazing to me that it's actually a nation after 2,000 years in 1948, and shows us that we are definitely in the last days. Antichrist will make a peace treaty with them. And so Israel, it's in the annals of every parliament and every government that you could possibly imagine in Europe, even America, obviously they're our ally. And so Israel's being vied up, it's being looked at, it's being commented on, it's being debated everywhere. The good news for proponents of annexation is that while such dramatic developments are possible, none are usually likely. The bad news for them, however, is what annexation means in the longer term. It will set off a process that will further erode Israeli democracy. It'll isolate Israel internationally and undermine the bipartisan U.S. support that has been so central to its success. How will Antichrist rectify that? Well, I believe he'll strike a peace deal with them, as I told you last week, and I believe he will forbid the Arab neighbors to be aggressive to them. He will allow them to rebuild their temple. They will lay down their arms, and obviously they will be subject to something that's going to come that Revelation talks about. So it's pretty interesting to see that Israel is right in the forefront of our news and right in the forefront of our prophecy. When we talk about economy, listen to this one, which should get you a little upset. It's an insult to injury news. Cities and states want you to pay for COVID fallout. Major tax increases are coming. Serious signs of an emerging financial crisis are already here. Americans are scrambling to adjust their lifestyle to a totally new world order. At the top of the food chain, though, is government, city, county, state, and federal. In the midst of such bizarre and frightful socioeconomic crisis, the tax man is hurting too. Tax revenues at all levels of government have plummeted like never before, and the pain is essentially acute for city budgets, who've seen sales tax revenues nosedive. While the American citizenry is seeing a drastic drop in income, so is Uncle Sam and all of his bureaucratic agencies. Take a look at some of the numbers. It estimates that state budget shortfalls will ultimately reach almost 10% in the current fiscal year, which ends on June 30th in most states. About 25% in the fiscal year 2021, based on recent economic projections. Kansas estimates an $827 million drop in revenue. Arizona, a drop by $1.4 billion. Arkansas, $353 million less in revenue. It goes on. California expects revenues to decline by $32 billion in 2021 alone. New York's tax revenues will fall by $12 billion in 2021 and $16 billion in 2022. Colorado's revenue could drop as much as $3.2 billion in 2021 and $2.4 billion in 2022. For states like Texas, which, by the way, let me just add something here. Texas, it's just off this subject, but I want to put it. Texas and Florida today were found that their COVID cases have been inflated by 10%. And they agreed that they have some egregious errors, but the amount of cases that they're claiming to have are up as much as 10% that are not there. So we're watching a lot of weird things going on. But for states like Texas, talking about taxes again, Alaska and New Mexico, which depend on oil revenue to balance their budgets, their financial hit will be a double whammy. Alaska is projecting an $850 million decline in revenues in the coming fiscal year. New Mexico could see a $2 billion drop. While Americans clamor to figure out how to make ends meet in their own households, so too is government trying to figure out how to balance budget. And the reality is that once these emergency accounting measures really begin to sink in, Americans aren't going to like it one bit. And again, I want to get political with you for a moment. We know that presidential candidate Biden will raise taxes. He just came out this week, to talk about a $1.2 billion to make America green by 2025, which will eliminate, he says we're going to create 1 million jobs. He doesn't tell you that he's going to eliminate 15 million jobs as he eradicates coal, gas, and oil. So we're watching some really strange things going on in the American economy, and it's going to be a flip-flop depending on who gets elected. Let me give you a little bit more about that. The question for mayors and governors will be, how much money can we extract from the people without causing extreme poverty and triggering widespread revolt? Take note, Nashville Mayor John Cooper is openly proposing raising property taxes by 32% in order to correct an estimated $250 million budget shortfall. There's no choice but to have a significant increase in property taxes, he says. Dallas, Texas is looking at a proposed 8% increase in property taxes. Expecting a $700 million shortfall, Chicago's Mayor Lightfoot has said that a property tax increase is on the table. California is considering a partial reversal of Proposition 13, which would allow government to assess commercial properties differently, creating an increase in property tax revenue without actually increasing the property tax rate. Arizona, where taxes would be raised on incomes above $250,000 to boost teacher salaries. Colorado, which is targeting corporations for at least $151 million in taxes to fund out-of-school learning. And North Carolina, which would issue bonds worth $1.9 billion in part for school capital improvements. New York is pitching the idea of a tax increase for wealthier people. New Jersey expected to see an increase in taxes as the governor moves to borrow billions of dollars to cover budget gaps. CNBC reports that many states across the nation will be looking at tax increases in many areas, including corporate income taxes, online purchases, excise taxes, sales taxes, property taxes, and gross receipt taxes. Mr. and Mrs. America, even though you didn't create the fraud in the financial system, and even though you were forced to close down your businesses, you will now be used as a tax cattle to pay for it. Let me add to this article. I just heard another news article that says this, that for all the destruction that CHOP did in Seattle mayor is going to tax the businesses that were actually targeted to pay for the destruction. So we're watching an America gone totally wild. We're watching America, the leftists and the Democrats have killed this country, and they're bringing it right down the tubes. And I'll make no bones about that. That's what they're doing. Let me give you a little bit about war. Not that you need any more good news or bad news. China threatens to blow up U.S. aircraft carriers. The U.S. sent 2 carrier groups to the South China Sea recently in a show of force intended to intimidate China in its aggressive takeover of a disputed archipelago. China responded by boasting of its wide selection of anti-aircraft carrier weapons, claiming that the mega warships operated at the pleasure of the PLA, People's Liberation Army. The response by the U.S. Navy was short and to the point. We're not intimidated. The decision to send the 2 nuclear-powered carriers, the USS Nimitz and the USS Ronald Reagan, into the South China Sea for dual carrier operations and exercise was bound to ruffle the feathers of the Chinese government. This is the first time since 2014 that 2 carriers have been in the region, and China is currently conducting a 5-day drill around the Parcel Islands. The Parcel Islands, essentially an archipelago, is a group of 130 islands approximately equidistant from the coastlines of the People's Republic of China and Vietnam, and also in proximity to the Philippines. The archipelago is surrounded by productive fishing grounds and a seabed with potential but yet unexplored oil and gas reserves. As such, they have been long focusing as a dispute between the 3 countries. So again, we talk about Revelation, we talk about prophecy. Kings of the East are China. We know that Israel's in there. We know Gog and Magog is Russia. All those players have a hand in our world affairs right now, and that's why I bring you this in the news. Let me give you a little bit more Christians and politics. I know there's lots in the news tonight, but I want to really inform you. Christians cannot ignore politics. A lot of pastors say, I'm not getting involved in that, because politics are not ignoring us. 2 deeply disappointing decisions from the U.S. Supreme Court. One, a dramatic expansion of LGBT rights. The other, dramatic curtailing of pro-life legislation, have sparked another round of discussion in social conservative circles about the way forward for Christian communities. Many voted for Trump solely because he would build up the judicial dikes needed to, at least temporarily, hold back the surging cultural revolution. Most did not expect the dikes to spring leaks so soon. Over at the Gospel Coalition, Kevin DeYoung suggests that it is time for Christians to take a second look at Rod Dreher's Benedict option, which he summarized in a 2-step process. Have more children and raise them in the Christian faith. This is his way of counterbalancing the culture. It may well be that Christian enclaves will be systematically and relentlessly targeted by those who believe that Christian beliefs and abuse in and of themselves, especially with regard to perceived rigidity on sexual matters. So abuse is going to come to Christians. Christians are going to start to be on the chopping block, not that we not already are. Because of our beliefs, we're already being termed as being hate speechers because of our beliefs. The young has come under a lot of fire from evangelicals who appear to have intentionally misread his column. The choice before us is not whether we shall engage in the public square on the one hand, or go home and bring up our children in the Lord on the other. The the public square today is over whether or not there is such a thing as our children. That is a very important point. The fact is that the progressive left does not believe that children belong to their parents, especially not when those parents believe their children belong to God. In Canada, Alberta's provincial government attempted to shut down Christian schools that refused to teach their secular ideology to children from Christian families, and would have succeeded had they not lost the next election. LGBT activists openly refer to Christian teaching as abusive, and it is a small step from redefining abuse to removing children from abusive homes based on new definition. Even Harry Potter author J.K. Rowling was told she can't be trusted around children simply for disputing one of the more recent manifestations of her gender ideology. And homeschooling isn't necessarily a fail-safe option either. One Harvard academic has been advocating for a ban on the practice lately and explicitly states that children should be exposed to other views. If terms like abuse and bigotry and hatred are redefined to include basic fundamentals of the Christian worldview, and that is absolutely the intent, by the way, then we could see dystopian scenarios unfold more quickly than we thought was possible. Those Christians who think they might have a stable refuge in their sound arguments for religious liberty are watching statue after statue toppled by angry mobs. Over on the other side of the street are cops and various other SWAT teams who are watching this spectacle also. These were the same cops who were required by their bosses to shut down churches and barbershops during the COVID lockdowns, but are required not to intervene when an unruly mob pulls over a statue of George Washington, visits Mount Rushmore, everybody while you still can. So what are we seeing? We're seeing a double standard. They're arresting church members who are practicing past their standards, but they're not doing anything to people who are pulling down statues. These totalitarian ignoramuses have to date toppled and or defaced statues of George Washington, Cervantes, Ulysses Grant, Robert E. Lee, Columbus, Francis Scott Key, Saint Sarah, not to mention a statue of Matthias Badwin, a lifelong abolitionist, and a memorial to black soldiers who fought for the Union. They want it all to turn, and if you don't think that your precious religious liberty is flammable, then you might have some surprises coming. They don't value what you value. They don't care what you care about. They belong to another religion. They worship other gods. This makes a difference, as it turns out. Christians are hopeful that they can achieve a live and let live consensus. The difficulty is that progressives have no desire to live and let live. As Tucker Carlson once put it, these are the sorts of folks that are sitting up in the middle of the night terrified and furious that someone in Alabama isn't on board with the full program. It isn't enough for you to just ignore what's going on because they demand affirmation and celebration. And when they get the power to do so, submission. There is no guarantee that the cultural revolutionaries will win, except for the fact that they are radical, growing in number, and have successfully colonized higher education, the public school system, the entertainment industry, and the Democratic Party, which all things considered is quite a lot. What is certain is that Christians and social conservatives must now operate with a mindset of resistance. Go back to those 5 points I told you. The culture's default now is one of poisonous entertainment that is consciously corrupting, pervasive pornography, and education designed to produce people with an anti-Christian worldview from our colleges right down. Ignoring politics is no longer a possibility because politics won't ignore you. If we do not engage, we guarantee that those who seek the suppression and destruction of our way of life will control all the levers of power, and anyone who has been paying attention knows what they wish to do with them. Abandoning politics is a real temptation. I get sick of hearing about it, to be honest with you, because politics is an incessant grind, and as social conservatives are increasingly spending most of their time defending sinking territory rather than promoting their own values. It's time for us to promote our own values. But that is precisely why politics is an unfortunate necessity, and perhaps, if you like, a necessary evil. If politics becomes an idol, then it will destroy us. Politicians are not our saviors, but retreating to the Shire only works if evil is kept at bay. Otherwise, the Shire burns too. Let me give you a little bit more of what's going on, maybe some good news for you. Revival in China. The number of Christians increase amid the persecutions in the pandemic. The church that may be experiencing revival due to the increase in the number of believers in the midst of so much oppression. This is a reality already observed in other periods of history where Christianity was severely persecuted, beginning in the first century of the Christian era. The fact that these churches exist that have become millions is probably the greatest revival in history, one pastor said. We saw how the COVID-19 has been used to persecute the entire church, he goes on, in North Korea, Iran, Pakistan, India, and even China. Christians, because they are not followers of the ideology of the state, are prevented from receiving food and aid, says this Christian pastor in China. According to some studies, the minister says that China may be the country with the largest number of Christians on the planet, being able to have about 224 million Christians by the year 2030. On the other hand, he also asked believers around the world to intercede for them and for the church in China. Tonight you need to pray for it. The idea is that if this persecution intensifies, the church will even grow faster and faster. It's kind of double-edged sword. Persecution leads to the growth of the church. However, persecution also separates families. So China, even though it has many problems, I'll read a couple more for you before we're ending our In the News tonight. Christians are growing. There's a revival happening in China. Persecution always is like a foot stepping on a fire. As it steps on that fire sparks and spreads everywhere. And that's exactly what's happening in China. Let me give you a little bit more as we go to the planet. Quite a few things. New pandemic threat. Like you need to hear another one. And guess where it's coming from? An alarming study recently appeared in a highly respected journal, Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, examining viruses found in pigs from 2011 to 2018. Chinese scientists identified a strain of the H1N1 flu virus that has all the essential hallmarks of a candidate pandemic virus. Reuters, June 29, 2020 says that. The study highlights the risks of viruses crossing the species barrier into humans, especially in densely populated regions in China, where millions live close to the farms, breeding facilities, slaughterhouses, and wet markets. The virus has already passed from animals to humans in some instances. However, scientists do not yet have evidence that the virus can pass from human to humans. When that happens, we're talking about another pandemic. It's sobering to realize that another pandemic could be in the making. The instructive truth is that many of these viruses, now listen to this, with pandemic potential arise from animals that the Bible clearly forbids to be eaten. Leviticus chapter 11, Deuteronomy 14. Exposure to these unclean animals puts the human population at great risk, and God knew it way back when, and obviously preserved Israel because of that. Let me give you a little bit more. City of China in China issues a bubonic plague alert. I told you this last week, and now it's starting to come to the surface. Health officials from a city in the Chinese region of the Inner Mongolia issued a bubonic plague warning on Sunday after a suspected case of highly infectious disease, which was known as the Black Death, was revealed. The health committee of the city of Baninur issued a third level of alert, the second highest category in a 4-level system. The notice requires citizens to report any suspected cases of plague or fever with no apparent causes. The warning period will be in effect throughout the end of the year. There were 4 reported cases of plagues in Inner Mongolia last November, including 2 of pneumonic plague, a deadlier variant of the plague, according to The Independent. So as we're watching all this news, and again, I know that it's depressing sometimes to see all the bad news or the news that's kind of threatening, but we know that it fits right into prophecy. So there's a certain excitement, not because the news is bad, but because we're narrowing down. Jesus said there'll be a lot of these signs that we would see, and many of them you've heard before. Wars, rumors of wars, pestilence and plagues, we've seen those. Earthquakes in diverse places. Well, let me give you an earthquake update. This is a seismic monitor for July. If you look at, this is the Ring of Fire. If you can go all the way around, you can go from Chile, South America, all the way up to Panama. You go to Baja, you go to the western United States, to western Canada, to Alaska, the Aleutian Islands. You jump over to Russia. You go down by China. You go down by Japan. You go all the way down by Australia, New Zealand, and all the way down Indonesia. That's the Ring of Fire. Well, it is heating up, no pun intended. And all those circles you see are recent earthquakes. We can see that the bigger the circle, the larger the earthquake. The color of the circles means the red in the past 5 years, past 2 weeks, or the yellow. The yellow is the past 2 weeks. Yesterday is the orange, and today is the bright red. So you can see that there is much activity, much more than normal in the Ring of Fire and in the earth. Earthquakes are increasing. It's labor pains of the earth. And so when people ask me if I think we're close, yes, I think we're close to the coming of Christ, not as an escape, but as something that's going to be a fulfillment of prophecy. And let me give you this. I think this is the last one. It is. So we have all these climate activists and all these people who are talking about climate change. This is shocking, and you're not going to hear it on CNN or CNBC or ABC. Forbes scrubs climate activist apology essay from website. Listen to it really well. Forbes published an apology essay on Sunday by Michael Schellenberger, a former environmental activist, but for whatever reason, perhaps bowing to pressure from left-wingers on staff or something else, the magazine has since removed it. In the op-ed, Schellenberger explained, "I would like to formally apologize," I'm quoting, "for the climate scare we created over the past 30 years. Schellenberger added in a tweet on Monday, "On behalf of environmentalists, I apologize for the climate scare. Climate change is real, but it's not the end of the world. It's not even our most important environmental problem. Whoops. Fortunately, Schellenberg was able to publish his censored article intended to promote his new book, Apocalypse Never, Why Environmental Alarmists Hurt Us All, on his own on the internet. Schellenberg has been a self-proclaimed climate activist for the last 20 years and has testified before Congress on this subject. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has selected him to serve as an expert reviewer of its next assessment report. You wouldn't think that. You would think by listening to the nightly news that climate change is one of our biggest problems. But obviously someone who is involved in it, someone who is on that side of it, someone who is warning for 30 years says, we've lied to everyone. It's not our biggest problem. So you'll see that snuffed out. Let me give you one last caveat before I lead in prayer, end in prayer. One of the things we're seeing the propagandization of our American media. Our American media is nothing more than a propaganda machine, and it's no better than Goebbels' propaganda machine of Hitler. We are watching things being fed to us every single night that are just not true. And when I first heard President Trump say fake news, I thought, well, he's just kind of backing out. But I really believe no more than fake news, it's made up news. It's news that's sensationalized. It's news that brings us to the point where we think that everything's falling in on us, and we need a cultural revolution. When we hear about the COVID cases, and we know that people are getting counted twice, 4 times, 5 times on COVID, we know that those are inflated. When we hear that it's a 10 times the number that normally is in Florida and Texas, we know it's being inflated. So you have to ask yourself a question: why? Why are we seeing all of this bombarded on us? Well, it's a couple of reasons. Number 1, to cause fear. Number 2, to get you off your center. And number 3, to accept a new change. A new change comes when people are scared, when they're afraid. The cultural shift and the paradigm shift that's coming is going to ride off the backs of people who are scared. Well, let me tell you something. My Bible says perfect love casts out all fear. There is no fear here today. There's no fear in me, and there should be no fear in you. So tonight, let's pray. Father, I thank you tonight. I thank you for your word. Even though we look at the news, Lord, and we see the things that are true and accurate when we report the news, Lord, we see so much false news that's out there. Lord, the true news is terrible enough, let alone the false news that tries to undergird people's lives, Lord, in their very mental state. Lord, I pray right now that we'd all realize that you are totally in control. Nothing happens except you allow it to happen. And I know it's for a wise purpose. I pray a blessing in every family that's listening tonight, Lord. Bless them, Lord, in Jesus' name. Amen. We'll be right back with our study, Psalm 75.